David woke up at exactly 5:30 in the morning, just like he had every single day for the past 20 years. His internal clock never failed him, even without an alarm. The old wooden cabin was silent, except for the gentle creaking of aged timber and the distant sound of wind moving through the pine trees outside his window. He sat on the edge of his narrow bed for a moment, running his weathered hands through his graying hair. The same routine, the same silence, the same emptiness that had become his entire world. At 52 years old, David had perfected the art of living like a ghost. The cabin was small but perfectly organized. Everything had its place, and David kept it that way with military precision. He had served in the army for 12 years before everything changed and old habits died hard. His boots sat exactly where they belonged by the door. His few clothes hung neatly in the tiny closet. The kitchen counter held only the essentials, nothing more, nothing less. David pulled on his worn jeans and flannel shirt, the same outfit he wore most days. Fashion meant nothing when nobody was around to see you. He walked to the kitchen and started his morning coffee, measuring the grounds with the same careful attention he gave to everything else. The ritual was important. It gave structure to days that otherwise stretched endlessly ahead of him. While the coffee brewed, he stepped outside onto his small porch. The Montana wilderness spread out before him in all directions, beautiful and completely empty of human life. That was exactly how he wanted it. The nearest town was 40 miles away, and his nearest neighbor was probably 15 miles in the other direction. He had chosen this isolation carefully. Deliberately, the morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and mountain streams. David took a deep breath and felt the familiar tightness in his chest. 20 years ago, he would have shared this moment with someone. He would have pointed out the deer moving carefully through the trees, or commented on how the morning light caught the peaks in the distance. But those days were buried so deep in his past that thinking about them felt like remembering someone else's life. He walked around his property, checking the small vegetable garden he maintained behind the cabin. The tomatoes were coming along nicely, and the beans were ready for picking. Growing his own food had become essential not just for survival, but for sanity. It gave him something to care for, something that depended on him without asking questions or expecting conversation. David picked what he needed for breakfast and went back inside. He cooked his eggs and ate them in complete silence, looking out the window at the forest. Sometimes he wondered if he had forgotten how to speak. Days would pass without him saying a single word out loud. What was the point? The trees didn't talk back, and the squirrels seemed perfectly content with his silence. After breakfast, he reviewed his mental list of daily tasks. The water pump needed checking, firewood needed splitting, and he had to walk the perimeter of his property to make sure no one was getting too close to his sanctuary. David had built his life around routine because routine meant he didn't have to think too much about anything else. The water pump was working fine, humming quietly as it drew water from the deep well he had dug his 3rd year here. David remembered those early days when everything was harder, when he was still learning how to live completely alone. He had made mistakes back then, burned food, let the fire die out on cold nights, struggled with the isolation. But humans adapt, and David had adapted better than most. He spent the next hour splitting firewood, the repetitive motion of swinging the axe helping to quiet his mind. Physical work was good for that. It kept his body strong and his thoughts busy. The stack of split logs grew steadily, and David felt the familiar satisfaction of completing a necessary task. Winter was still months away, but preparation was everything when you lived this far from civilization. Around noon, he took his weekly walk to check the hunting traps he had set around his property. David didn't hunt for sport anymore, hadn't touched a gun except for necessary hunting since he moved here. But he needed the meat, and trapping was more reliable than trying to shoot game with reflexes that weren't quite what they used to be. The first 3 traps were empty, which was normal. The 4th had caught a rabbit, which would provide protein for several days. David reset the trap efficiently and headed back toward his cabin, taking a different route through the forest. He knew every tree, every rock, every stream on his land. This place had become more familiar to him than any house he had ever lived in. As he walked, David caught himself listening for sounds that didn't belong. After 20 years of solitude, he had become incredibly sensitive to any change in his environment. A broken branch, footprints that weren't his own, the sound of a car engine in the distance, all of these things would set off alarm bells in his head. He needed his isolation protected at all costs. Back at the cabin, he cleaned and prepared the rabbit for dinner, another routine task that filled time and served a purpose. David had learned to be completely self-sufficient because depending on others had proven to be dangerous. People left you. People died. People broke your heart into so many pieces that you never quite figured out how to put it back together. The afternoon was spent reading, something David did for several hours every day. Books were his only real companions now. He had shelves lined with novels, biographies, technical manuals, and poetry. Reading kept his mind sharp and provided an escape when the silence became too heavy. Today he was working through a thick biography of a mountain climber who had attempted to summit several dangerous peaks alone. As evening approached, David prepared his simple dinner and ate while watching the sun set through his kitchen window. The sky turned brilliant orange and pink, reflecting off the mountain peaks in the distance. It was beautiful, but beauty felt different when you had no one to share it with. Everything felt different when you were alone. After dinner he sat on his porch for a while, listening to the forest settle into night. Owls called to each other across the darkness, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled. These were the sounds of his world now. Wild, untamed, and completely separate from the human world he had left behind. David went to bed at 9:30, just as he did every night. He lay in the darkness thinking about tomorrow, which would be exactly like today, which had been exactly like yesterday. The routine was comfortable now, predictable and safe. He had built a life that couldn't hurt him because it contained nothing that could be taken away. But sometimes in the quiet moments before sleep, David wondered if this was living or just surviving. The thought never lasted long, though. Wondering led to questions, and questions led to memories. And memories led to pain that he had spent 20 years learning to avoid. Tomorrow would bring another day of blessed, empty routine, and David would be ready for it. It was Tuesday morning when David set out to check his traps, following the same path he had walked every week for the past 20 years. The forest was quiet except for the crunch of pine needles under his worn boots and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. He carried his old canvas bag for any game he might find, and moved through the trees with the practiced silence of someone who had learned to become part of the wilderness. The first 2 traps were empty as usual. David didn't mind. Patience was something he had in abundance these days. He reset them carefully and continued along his familiar route, breathing in the crisp mountain air. The 3rd trap had caught a small ground squirrel, which he dispatched quickly and humanely before adding it to his bag. As he approached the 4th trap location, David heard something that made him freeze in place. It was a sound that didn't belong in his carefully ordered world. A soft whimpering, almost like an injured animal, but somehow different. Human different. His first instinct was to turn around and head back to his cabin. In 20 years of isolation, David had perfected the art of avoiding anything that might disrupt his peace. Strange sounds meant complications, and complications meant involvement with the outside world he had worked so hard to escape. But the sound came again. Weaker this time, and something deep inside him wouldn't let him walk away. Maybe it was his old military training, or maybe it was some buried piece of his humanity that refused to die completely. Whatever it was, David found himself moving carefully toward the source of the noise. He approached a small grove of birch trees about 50 yards off his usual path, placing each step deliberately to avoid making sound. The whimpering was clearer now, definitely human, definitely female, and definitely in distress. David's heart began beating faster than it had in years. His hands started to shake slightly, not from fear, but from the realization that his world was about to change. Through the trees he saw her. A woman, probably in her 30s, sitting against a large oak tree with her hands bound behind her back and her ankles tied together. Her dark hair was tangled with leaves and dirt, her clothes were torn in several places, and there was a nasty cut on her forehead that had dried blood running down her face. David's breath caught in his throat. 20 years. 20 years since he had been this close to another person. 20 years since he had looked into another human being's eyes. His first impulse was still to run, to pretend he had never seen this, to go back to his cabin and his safe, empty routine. But the woman looked up and saw him. Her eyes were brown and filled with fear, pain, and something that might have been hope. She tried to speak but only managed a hoarse whisper. "Please," was all she could get out, but that single word hit David like a physical blow. He stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds, his mind racing through possibilities. Help her and risk everything he had built. Walk away and live with the knowledge that he had abandoned someone who needed him. The choice should have been easy, but nothing about this moment felt easy. The woman was clearly dehydrated and had been there for some time. Whoever had done this to her was long gone. David could tell that much from the tracks and signs around the area. She was alone, hurt, and completely dependent on his help for survival. David stepped closer, and the woman flinched instinctively. "It's okay," he said, his voice rough and strange from disuse. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm going to help you." Those were the first words he had spoken to another person in more than 3 years, and they felt foreign in his mouth. But they seemed to calm the woman slightly. She stopped struggling against her bonds and watched him with cautious eyes. "My name is David," he continued, kneeling down beside her. "What's your name?" "Lisa," she whispered. "Lisa, please, I've been here since yesterday. I need water." David pulled his water bottle from his pack and held it to her lips. She drank, gratefully, some of the liquid spilling down her chin. As she drank, David examined her situation. The ropes were tight but not impossible to untie. Whoever had done this wasn't a professional, just someone with bad intentions and basic knots. "I'm going to untie you now," David said, his hands already shaking as he reached for the ropes. The moment his fingers touched the bindings, the moment he came into contact with another human being for the first time in 2 decades, something inside him shattered and rebuilt itself all at once. His hands were trembling so badly he could barely work the knots. The simple act of human contact, even through rope and clothing, was overwhelming. David had to stop several times to steady himself, to remember how to breathe normally. "Are you okay?" Lisa asked, noticing his distress. "I'm fine," David lied, focusing on the ropes around her wrists. "Just haven't done this in a while." That was the understatement of the century. David hadn't touched another person since he moved to these mountains. He hadn't shaken hands, hugged, or even bumped into someone accidentally. The sensation of helping another human being was both terrifying and oddly comforting. When he finally freed her hands, Lisa immediately tried to untie her own ankles, but her fingers were numb and unsteady. David gently moved her hands aside and finished the job himself. Each touch, each moment of contact, sent shockwaves through his system. "Can you stand?" he asked once she was free. Lisa tried to get up, but her legs buckled immediately. David caught her without thinking, his arms going around her shoulders to steady her. The contact was electric, overwhelming, and completely foreign. He hadn't held another person in 20 years, and the sensation nearly knocked him off balance. "Easy," he said, helping her sit back down against the tree. "You've been tied up for too long. Your circulation needs time to return to normal." David opened his pack and pulled out the small first aid kit he always carried. He had some antiseptic, wipes, and bandages that would help with the cut on her forehead. As he cleaned the wound, his hands gradually stopped shaking. The act of helping someone else, of being useful to another human being, awakened something in him that had been sleeping for decades. "Who did this to you?" he asked quietly. "I don't know," Lisa said, wincing as he applied antiseptic to her cut. "I was hiking alone on the trail about 2 miles from here. Someone came up behind me, knocked me out. When I woke up, I was tied to this tree. He was gone." David felt anger rise in his chest, an emotion he hadn't experienced in years. Someone had hurt this woman, left her here to die, and that was unacceptable. His protective instincts, buried under decades of isolation, suddenly roared back to life. "You need medical attention," he said, applying a bandage to her forehead. And you need food and rest? My cabin isn't far from here? Lisa looked at him. With surprise? You live out here? 20 years, David said simply. It's not much, but it's safe and warm. Can you walk if I help you? She nodded, and David helped her to her feet. This time she stayed upright, though she leaned heavily on his arm. The weight of another person depending on him felt strange and wonderful and terrifying all at once. As they started the slow walk back to his cabin, David realized that his carefully constructed world of solitude was over. And for the first time in 20 years, he wasn't entirely sure that was a bad thing. The walk back to David's cabin took nearly an hour, though it normally only took him 15 minutes. Lisa could barely put one foot in front of the other, and David found himself supporting most of her weight as they moved slowly through the forest. Every few minutes, they had to stop so she could rest against a tree and catch her breath. David's mind was racing the entire time. 20 years of carefully planned solitude was about to be shattered by bringing another person into his sacred space. His cabin was his sanctuary, the one place in the world where he felt completely safe and in control. Now he was voluntarily bringing chaos into that ordered world, but looking at Lisa's pale face and the way she struggled with each step, David knew he had no choice. The nearest hospital was 40 miles away over rough mountain roads. Even if his old truck started, which wasn't guaranteed, she might not survive the journey in her current condition. And calling for help would mean explaining who he was, where he had been for 20 years, and why he was living alone in the mountains. That conversation was something David wasn't ready to have with anyone. When they finally reached the cabin, David hesitated at the porch steps. This was his last chance to change his mind, to take Lisa to the road and flag down help from someone else. But one look at her exhausted face made the decision for him. "Welcome to my home," he said quietly, helping her up the steps. David opened the door and guided Lisa inside, immediately regretting the decision. The cabin felt impossibly small with another person in it. Lisa looked around at his neat, sparse living space with curious eyes, taking in the military precision of everything from his perfectly made bed to his carefully organized kitchen. "Sit here," David said, helping her to his one comfortable chair, near the fireplace. It was the same chair he had sat in every evening for the past 20 years, reading his books and listening to the forest settle into darkness. Now it held someone else, someone who would leave fingerprints and warmth and the memory of human presence long after she was gone. Lisa sank into the chair gratefully, her head falling back against the worn cushions. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know how to thank you enough." David didn't know how to respond to gratitude. It had been so long since anyone had thanked him for anything. He just nodded and moved to his kitchen, his hands shaking again as he tried to figure out what to do next. Taking care of another person was not something covered in his daily routine. "You need food and water," he said, more to himself than to her, "and those cuts need proper cleaning." David put water on to boil and pulled out his more extensive first aid supplies from a cabinet he rarely opened. Along with his military training came basic medical knowledge, though he hadn't used it on another person in decades. His hands were steadier now that he had something specific to focus on. "Can you tell me what hurts the most?" he asked, kneeling beside her chair with his supplies. "My head, mostly, and my wrists where the ropes were." Lisa held up her hands, showing raw red marks where the bindings had cut into her skin. David examined her wrists carefully, trying not to think about how long it had been since he had touched another person with gentleness instead of just necessity. Her skin was soft and warm, completely different from his own weather-beaten hands. The contrast made him acutely aware of how isolated he had become, how removed from basic human experience. "This might sting," he warned, applying antiseptic to the rope burns. Lisa winced but didn't pull away. As David worked, he found himself falling into a rhythm he remembered from his army days, when taking care of injured soldiers was part of his regular duties. His hands moved with surprising confidence, cleaning wounds and applying bandages with practiced efficiency. "You're good at this," Lisa observed, watching him work. "Had some training a long time ago," David said, not wanting to elaborate. When he finished with her wrists, David moved to examine the cut on her forehead more thoroughly. The bleeding had stopped, but it needed better cleaning than he had been able to provide in the forest. As he worked, Lisa studied his face, noting the deep lines around his eyes and the careful way he avoided looking directly at her. "How long have you lived out here alone?" she asked softly. David's hands stilled for a moment. "A while. It must get lonely." "No," David said quickly, too quickly. "I prefer it this way." Lisa didn't push, but David could feel her watching him as he finished cleaning her wound. There was something unsettling about being observed so closely, about having another person trying to understand him. He had forgotten how vulnerable it felt to be seen. The water on the stove began to whistle, giving David an excuse to move away. He made tea, something he rarely drank himself, but somehow seemed appropriate for someone who had been through trauma. As he prepared the cup, David realized he was trying to remember how to be hospitable, how to care for a guest. These were skills he had buried so deeply he wasn't sure they still existed. "Here," he said, bringing her the steaming mug. Their fingers brushed as she took it, and David felt that same electric shock of human contact. He pulled his hand away quickly, but not before noticing how cold her skin was. "You're freezing," he said. Looking at her torn clothing and the way she was shivering despite the warmth of the cabin, without thinking, David went to his closet and pulled out a thick wool blanket. He wrapped it around Lisa's shoulders, his hands briefly resting on her arms as he adjusted the fabric. The simple act of tucking someone in, of providing comfort and warmth, brought back memories he had spent 20 years trying to forget. "Better?" he asked. Lisa nodded, pulling the blanket closer around herself. "Much better, thank you." David sat down in his kitchen chair, the only other seat in the small cabin, and watched as Lisa sipped her tea, the sight of another person in. His space was surreal, like watching a movie of someone else's life. Everything felt different with her there. The silence that usually comforted him now felt heavy and awkward. The routines that structured his days seemed suddenly pointless and strange. "What's your last name?" Lisa asked, breaking into his thoughts. "Does it matter?" David replied. "I suppose not. But I'd like to know something about the man who saved my life." David considered this. He could make something up, give her a fake name and a simple story. But something about her direct gaze and the gratitude in her voice made lying feel wrong. "Johnson," he said finally. "David Johnson? Nice to meet you properly, David Johnson." "I'm Lisa Chun." The exchange felt both formal and intimate, like they were acknowledging that this moment mattered somehow. David found himself studying Lisa's face, noting the intelligence in her dark eyes and the strength in her voice despite her obvious exhaustion. As the afternoon wore on, David made Lisa a simple meal of soup and bread, the most elaborate cooking he had done for another person in decades. He watched her eat, noting with satisfaction that some color was returning to her cheeks. Taking care of someone else, being responsible for another person's well-being, awakened something in him that had been dormant for so long he had forgotten it existed. "You should rest," he said when she finished eating. "You can take my bed. I'll sleep in the chair." "I can't take your bed," Lisa protested. "You need real rest, and that chair won't give it to you," David said firmly. It was the first decisive thing he had said all day, and it surprised them both. As David helped Lisa to his bed and made sure she was comfortable, he realized that, for the first time in 20 years, he wasn't thinking about tomorrow's routine or tonight's solitude. Instead, he was thinking about another person's needs, another person's comfort, and despite everything he had built his life around, that didn't feel like a burden. It felt like purpose. Lisa slept for 14 hours straight. David knew because he stayed awake the entire time, sitting in his kitchen chair and listening to the sound of another person breathing in his space. It was the strangest night of his life in 20 years. Every few hours he would check on her, making sure she was still breathing normally and that her fever hadn't returned. When she finally woke up the next morning, Lisa looked much better. The color had returned to her face and her eyes were clearer and more alert. David had been making breakfast when he heard her stirring, and he quickly set another place at his small table. "How do you feel?" he asked as she emerged from the bedroom, still wrapped in his blanket. Like a human being again, Lisa said with a small smile. Thank you for letting me sleep in your bed. That's the most comfortable I've been in days. David felt heat rise in his cheeks. Compliments were another thing he had forgotten how to handle. You needed the rest. Sit down, breakfast is ready. They ate in relative silence at first, both of them adjusting to the strange situation of sharing a meal. David found himself watching Lisa eat, noting that she had a good appetite and seemed much stronger than the day before. When she caught him staring, he quickly looked away, embarrassed. You don't talk much, do you? Lisa said gently. Don't have much reason to, David replied. Haven't had anyone to talk to in a long time. How long exactly? David hesitated. The truth felt too big, too difficult to explain. But something about Lisa's patient expression made him want to try. 20 years, he said quietly, give or take. Lisa set down her fork and looked at him with surprise. 20 years? You haven't spoken to another person in 20 years? Not really. Maybe a few words to delivery drivers or store clerks when I had to go to town for supplies, but that was years ago. I grow my own food now, fix my own problems. That's incredible, Lisa said, but not in a way that made David feel judged. What made you choose such complete isolation? David's hands tightened around his coffee mug. This was the question he had been dreading, the one that led to all the memories he had spent 2 decades trying to bury. Sometimes life gives you more than you can handle, he said carefully. Sometimes the only way to survive is to step away from everything. Lisa nodded, as if she understood, which surprised David. Most people would have pushed for details, demanded explanations. But Lisa just sat quietly, waiting for him to say more or to move on to something else. What about you? David asked, trying to redirect the conversation. What were you doing hiking alone out here? Running away, I suppose, Lisa said with a bitter laugh. Different method, same idea as yours? Running from what? My life falling apart. Lisa stared into her coffee cup as if it might hold answers. I'm a social worker, was a social worker. I spent 15 years trying to help kids who had been hurt, abandoned, abused. I thought I was making a difference, but last month I lost a case, a little girl I had been working with for 2 years. Her father got custody back despite everything I documented, everything I fought for. David saw pain in her eyes that looked familiar, the kind of hurt that came from feeling responsible for something terrible. 3 days later, she was in the hospital, Lisa continued. And I realized that all my good intentions, all my reports, and court appearances and sleepless nights worrying about these kids, sometimes it just isn't enough. Sometimes you can't save people no matter how hard you try. So you quit? David asked. I had a breakdown in my supervisor's office, started crying and couldn't stop for 2 hours. They put me on administrative leave, suggested I take some time to think about whether I wanted to continue in social work. Lisa's voice was barely above a whisper now. My husband couldn't handle it. Saad, I was too emotional, too invested in other people's problems, filed for divorce while I was still on leave. David felt something shift in his chest, a recognition of shared pain that he hadn't expected. Here was someone else who had tried to protect people and failed, someone else whose world had collapsed when they couldn't save the ones who mattered most. So you came out here to hike alone? He asked. I came out here to figure out if I wanted to keep living, Lisa said simply. The honesty of that statement hit David like a physical blow. He recognized the sentiment because he had felt it himself many times over the past 20 years. The difference was that he had found a way to keep existing without really living, while Lisa had been actively searching for reasons to continue. I'm glad you decided to keep going, David said quietly. Are you? Lisa asked, studying his face. Because it seems like you stopped living 20 years ago and just forgot to die. David's first instinct was to be angry at her directness, but something about the gentle way she said it took the sting out of the words. Instead, he found himself considering whether she was right. Maybe, he admitted. But existing is easier than living. Living requires hope, and hope is dangerous. Why is hope dangerous? Lisa asked. David was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the forest that had been his entire world for so long. Lisa didn't push, just waited with the patience of someone who was used to helping people find their words. Because when you hope for something, when you love something, it can be taken away, David finally said. And when it's gone, the pain is worse than anything you can imagine. What was taken from you? Lisa asked softly. David felt his chest tighten, felt the familiar wall trying to slam shut around his heart. But something about Lisa's presence, about the way she had shared her own pain so openly, made it harder to hide behind his usual silence. My wife, he said, the words feeling strange and rusty in his mouth, and my daughter. Lisa waited, not asking for details but clearly willing to listen if he wanted to share them. Car accident, David continued, each word feeling like it was being pulled from somewhere deep inside him. 20 years ago. I was driving, it was raining, and I took a turn too fast. The car skidded off the road and hit a tree. Oh, David, Lisa said quietly. I walked away with a broken arm and some cuts. David's voice was barely audible now. My wife died on impact. My daughter lived for 3 days in the hospital before her injuries were too much. David had never said those words out loud before, not to anyone. For 20 years, the story had lived only in his nightmares and the dark hours before dawn when sleep wouldn't come. I'm so sorry, Lisa said, and David could hear tears in her voice. It was my fault, David said. I was supposed to protect them, and I failed. So I came here where I couldn't fail anyone else? Lisa reached across the table and covered his hand. With hers, the contact was warm and startling, but David didn't pull away this time. It wasn't your fault, she said firmly. Accidents happen, bad weather happens. You didn't choose for that to occur. I chose to drive too fast. You made a mistake. That doesn't make you responsible for a tragedy. David looked at their joined hands, noting how small and soft hers were compared to his weathered fingers. He couldn't remember the last time someone had touched him with kindness instead of just necessity. How do you live with it? He asked. The guilt of not being able to save someone? I'm still figuring that out, Lisa admitted. But I think maybe the answer isn't to stop trying to connect with people. Maybe it's to find a way to honor the ones we lost by helping the ones we can still reach. David felt something crack inside. His chest, some wall that had been holding back 20 years of grief and regret. For the first time since the accident, he wondered if Lisa might be right. By the 5th day, Lisa was strong enough to walk around the cabin without help. Her cuts had healed nicely and the color had fully returned to her face. David found himself both relieved by her recovery and strangely sad about what it meant. Soon she would be well enough to leave, and his cabin would return to its familiar silence. They had fallen into an easy routine over the past few days. David would make breakfast while Lisa tidied up the small space, something she did without being asked. They would eat together, talking about books, the weather, or small memories from their pasts. In the afternoons, David would work on his daily tasks while Lisa rested or read from his collection of books. Evenings were spent sitting by the fireplace, sharing stories and comfortable silences. For the first time in 20 years, David wasn't lonely. The realization hit him like a cold splash of water. He had convinced himself that he preferred solitude, that he was happier alone, but these past few days had shown him how much he had been missing. Having someone to talk to, someone to care, for someone who cared about him in return, had awakened parts of himself he thought were dead forever on the morning of the 6th day. Lisa brought up the subject they had both been avoiding. I should probably head back to town soon, she said over breakfast, not meeting David's eyes. People will be looking for me by now. I told my sister I'd be back by last weekend. David felt his chest tighten. He had known this moment would come, but he wasn't prepared for how much it would hurt. Of course, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. You have a life to get back to? Do I? Lisa asked, finally looking at him. I'm unemployed, getting divorced, and I came out here because I wasn't sure I wanted to keep living. What exactly am I going back to? David didn't have an answer for that. He understood the feeling all too well. What about you? Lisa asked. Are you planning to stay here forever? This is my home, David said automatically, but the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. This isn't a home, David. This is a hiding place. The bluntness of her statement should have made him angry, but instead it made him think. Was she right? Had he been hiding all these years instead of living? Lisa stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the forest that surrounded them. I've been thinking about what you said the other day about hope being dangerous. Maybe you're right. Maybe hope is dangerous. But you know what's more dangerous? What? David asked, giving up entirely. Deciding that because something terrible happened once, nothing good can ever happen again. David joined her at the window. Side by side, they looked out at the mountains and trees that had been his entire world for so long. I used to believe I could save everyone, Lisa continued. Every kid I worked with, every family I tried to help. When I realized I couldn't, I felt like a complete failure. But maybe the real failure would be stopping entirely, never trying to help anyone again because I'm afraid of getting hurt. What are you saying? David asked Dot. Lisa turned to face him. I'm saying maybe we both need to stop running from life. Maybe we need to take the risk of hoping again. David felt something shift inside him, something he hadn't felt in decades. It wasn't hope exactly, not yet, but it was possibility. The possibility that life could be more than just survival, more than just existing from one day to the next. I wouldn't even know how to start, he admitted. Neither would I, Lisa said with a small smile. But maybe we could figure it out together. The suggestion hung in the air between them. David's first instinct was to say no, to retreat back into the safety of his isolation. But as he looked at Lisa's face, at the hope and fear and determination he saw there, he realized she was offering him something precious. She was offering him a chance to live again. I haven't been around people in 20 years, David said. I don't know how to function in the normal world anymore. I just had a breakdown at work and my husband left me because I cared too much about strangers' children, Lisa replied. I don't think either of us is ready for normal. But maybe we're ready for something better than hiding. David was quiet for a long time, considering her words. The idea of leaving his cabin, of facing the world again after 2 decades of isolation was terrifying. But the idea of going back to his empty routine after experiencing these few days of human connection was somehow even worse. What would we do? He asked. I don't know, Lisa admitted. But I have some money saved up, and you probably have skills that could be useful somewhere. Maybe we could find a small town, somewhere quiet but not completely isolated. Maybe I could go back to social work eventually, and you could find something that uses your practical abilities. David thought about this. He was good with his hands, good at fixing things and building things. After 20 years of complete self-sufficiency, he had skills that might be valuable in the right place. It's a big risk, he said. Everything worth doing is a risk, Lisa replied. But David, look what happened when you took the risk to help me. You saved my life, but more than that, you reminded both of us that we're not dead yet, that we still have something to offer the world. David looked around his cabin at the space that had been his entire universe for so long. It was clean and organized and completely under his control. It was also empty and cold and devoid of real life. I don't even have a driver's license anymore, he said. No credit cards, no bank accounts. I've been completely off the grid. Those are just paperwork problems, Lisa said. They can be fixed if you want to fix them, and if I can't handle it? If being around people again is too much? Lisa reached out and took his hand, just like she had the day before when he told her about the accident. Her touch was warm and steady and real. Then we'll figure something else out. But David, you handled taking care of me just fine. You were kind and gentle, and exactly what I needed when I needed it most. You're not as broken as you think you are. David felt tears building in his eyes for the first time in years. Not tears of sadness or regret, but tears of something that might have been relief. Maybe even hope. Okay, he said quietly. Okay? Lisa asked, as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Okay, let's try it. Let's see if 2 broken people can figure out how to live again. Lisa's smile was bright enough to light up the entire cabin. She threw her arms around David, hugging him tightly, and for the first time in 20 years he hugged back. 2 days later, David locked the door of his cabin and walked away. In his truck, which started on the third try, he had packed a few clothes, some tools, and a small box containing the last photos of his wife and daughter. Lisa sat beside him, her own small bag of belongings in her laptop, as they drove down the mountain road toward town. David felt scared and excited and more alive than he had in decades. He didn't know what came next, but for the first time since the accident, he was curious to find out. "Thank you," he said to Lisa as they reached the main highway. "For what?" she asked. "For reminding me that some things are worth the risk of hoping for," Lisa smiled and squeezed his hand. "Thank you for showing me that sometimes the most important person you can save is yourself." Together they drove toward whatever came next. Two people who had learned that healing doesn't happen in isolation, but in the brave act of choosing to connect with life again.